All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Red Hill Rediscovered on Christian slavery and religious freedom in early America. My name is Lucia Butler. I'm a staff archaeologist, and today I'm joined by Dr. Katharine Gerbner. I'll give you a quick introduction to her. Dr. Gerbner is a historian of religion, slavery, and freedom. She's the author of Christian Slavery, Conversation and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, and also Archival Irruptions, Constructing Religion and Criminalizing Obeah in 18th-Century Jamaica. She's an associate professor of history and director of the Religious Studies program at the University of Minnesota. So Dr. Gerbner, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to hear about your work and your research. For those of you who are watching, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to post those at any point. We're going to have a little time at the end where we'll be able to go through those and answer those. So without further ado, Dr. Gerbner, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to present here, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen. So today I will be talking about my book, as you've heard, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. I think I can, there we go, switch to it. And I'll start actually by talking a little bit about the title itself. What do I mean by Christian slavery? Because I think to most people, Christianity and slavery seem like they're naturally opposed. But when we look at the history of early America, the picture is much more complicated. And so my book and my research look at this more difficult history. So I examine, for example, how European Christians tried to reconcile slaveholding with their religious convictions, and how Christianity played a role in creating slave law in early America. The tension between Christianity, freedom, and slavery was also a central feature of Patrick Henry's life. And while Henry is not the focus of today's talk, my hope is that the history I describe here can shed some light on the ideas and beliefs that shaped his life and his upbringing especially. Because what I'm going to be focusing on today is the relationship between Christianity and slavery the century before the Revolution. So beginning in the 1660s until about the mid-1700s. And it's this period when English Protestants were settling colonies in the Americas and actually establishing slavery as one of the primary economic and social institutions in early America. So this is obviously not easy stuff, and I've actually often been asked, why I chose to devote more than a decade of my life to studying these questions. And so I'm going to get into talking about my book by really telling you a personal story of sort of how I came to write about this history. Because I actually didn't intend to write a book called Christian Slavery. My intention was actually to write a book about the origins of anti-slavery and the abolitionist movement. So I began my research quite a long time ago for what became Christian slavery with this document. So this is a copy of the 1688 Quaker anti-slavery protest. It was the first document in North America to denounce slavery. And for those of you who may have heard about the Quakers only in passing, a quick reminder, they're a small Protestant denomination that are probably best known for their peace testimony and for the important role that they played in the abolitionist movement to end slavery. I was really excited to write about the 1688 anti-slavery protest because I also had a personal connection to it. I grew up in Philadelphia and I went to a Quaker school just blocks away from where this anti-slavery protest was written. And as I learned, I had actually passed the site where it had been created hundreds of times as I drove from my home to school every day. And as a student in a Quaker school, I had been taught the role of the Quakers in the abolitionist movement and how important they were to leading the movement to end slavery. So I thought there was a lot to learn about this first anti-slavery protest and a lot to be proud of. And in fact, this is a really extraordinary document. So it's hard to read the words here, but I'll read some of the most important parts. So it declares, among other things, that authors are, quote, against the traffic of men's body. It continues to explain that slavery cannot be a Christian practice, that it's against the golden rule. And here's a few more lines. There is a saying, the authors write, that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. And those who steal or rob men and those who buy or purchase them, are they not all alike? Here is liberty of conscience, which is right and reasonable. Here ought to be likewise liberty of the body. So for the 17th century, this is actually a really unusual document. And it's a document that all Quakers, all Christians, really all Americans can be proud of. So I was excited to write about it, and I thought it could show us how we could learn about sort of social justice by studying the past. But as I looked closer at the protest, I became less interested in the petition itself than in this last line that was added not by the authors of the protest, but actually by Quakers who represented the Abington monthly meeting and the Philadelphia yearly meeting. So this is a close-up, and I'll again read it to you. We have inspected the matter above mentioned and considered of it. We find it so weighty that we think it not expedient for us to meddle with it here. Below that, there's another line. A paper being here presented by some German friends concerning the lawfulness and unlawfulness of buying and keeping Negroes, it was adjudged not to be so proper for this meeting to give a positive judgment in the case, it having so general a relation to many other parts, and therefore at present they forbear it. Okay, so this is convoluted 17th century language, but if you're wondering what this means, it means that they rejected the protest. While I had intended to study anti-slavery, I felt like this was more important. What it revealed is that while there was a very small minority of Quakers who were rejecting slavery in the 17th century, most actually did not. And despite the fact that I'd gone to Quaker school my entire life, I had no idea up to that point that there were Quakers who had also enslaved other people. I also had other questions. What did it mean that slavery had, quote, so general a relationship to many other parts, right? What other parts were they talking about? So to answer this question, I had to dig deeper into the 17th century Atlantic world. And at the time, I was surprised to learn that slavery was actually accepted in common, not only among most Europeans, but also among Quakers. And that wasn't all. Quakers were also involved in the slave trade. It turns out that many Quakers in Philadelphia, whose history I'd learned growing up, had actually immigrated not from England, but from the Caribbean island of Barbados. And this is a 17th century map of Barbados actually created by a Quaker. So he does not draw in any of the military forts because of his peace testimony, but we do have all of the plantations. So Pennsylvania may have been the first official Quaker colony, but it was not the first Quaker community in the Americas. There was this large Quaker presence on Barbados, where thousands of Friends lived, and in the 1670s, it was called the Nursery of Truth because it was so filled with Quakers. When Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, William Penn, the founder, and other Quakers used their Quaker connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. As Pennsylvania's social and economic structure developed, ties with the West Indies and other trade outlets flourished. And this trade with Barbados was considered to be an important source of economic pride for many English Quakers who thought that slavery was necessary for economic development. So I realized I needed to tell this story, right? Like many stories that are maybe less heroic, a little bit embarrassing. This one actually had been largely suppressed in the Quakers' histories that I had grown up with. Most scholarship about Quakers and slavery in this period, even when it acknowledged that Quakers were sometimes enslavers, it still focused on finding the seed of abolition in early Quaker records. I decided to ask different questions. So instead of reading abolition back in time, I thought it was important to understand how slave-owning Quakers, as well as other Christians, fit into their own time. None of them would have predicted the demise of the slave trade or of slavery. So if I really wanted to understand them and the relationship between Christianity and slavery, I needed to take a different approach. So I decided to expand the scope of my research beyond the Quakers to include other Christian denominations. So I chose to focus on the Church of England, the Anglicans, and the Moravian Church, a small Protestant denomination that was headquartered in Eastern Germany. So these three Protestant denominations, it turns out, were the first Protestant organization to actually send missionaries to convert enslaved people to Christianity. And as a result, you find more of a reckoning, a thinking about the relationship between Christianity and slavery in the records from these churches. So, why did Christians accept slavery in this period? How did they justify slavery within their theological worldview? I also wanted to think about what Christianity might have meant to enslaved and free Black men and women who became Christian. When and why did they convert? So these became the questions that fueled my research. And I started by taking a closer look at Barbados. So Barbados, for those who don't know, was actually the most important English colony in the 17th century. It was settled in 1627, and colonists soon began to plant tobacco and then sugar. And while English colonists initially relied on a joint labor force of European indentured servants and enslaved Africans, by about the 1650s, enslaved Africans had become the majority of the labor force. And it was around the same time that Quakerism started to flourish on the islands. So two Quaker missionaries named Anne Fisher and Mary Austin landed on the island in 1655 and successfully converted, or as Quakers would say, convinced several island residents. Two decades later, there were thousands of Quakers living on Barbados, all but four of whom were slave owners. By the 1670s, the Quaker founder George Fox decided to visit the Quaker communities on the islands in the colonies, and Barbados was his first stop. He eventually went farther north as well. There, he became really concerned about the practice of slavery. This is the first time he had really encountered a full-blown slave society. But he didn't respond in the ways that we might expect. So he did urge Quakers to consider manumission. He did not call for an end to slavery as a practice. Instead, he did something else. He urged friends to worship with enslaved people in their households and to introduce them to Quakerism. And so I think in many ways, this is somewhat disappointing. Right? And in fact, much of the scholarship on Fox's visit to Barbados debates whether his remarks could be considered proto-anti-slavery or not. But again, when we focus on anti-slavery, I think we really miss an important point. And that important point has to do with the reaction of other colonists on Barbados. So in 1675, a few years after Fox's visit, English colonists discovered that a group of enslaved men were planning a rebellion. In response, the English colonists took drastic measures. They executed the enslaved rebels, they tortured others, they rewarded informants. They also did something unusual. They passed an act that forbid Quakers from worshiping alongside enslaved men and women. I'm going to read a passage from the act here. The act asserted that enslaved people had, quote, been suffered to remain at the meeting of Quakers as hearers of their doctrine and taught in their principles, whereby the safety of this island may be hazarded. If the act continued, any enslaved person was, quote, found with the said people called Quakers at any time of their meeting, and as hearers of their preaching, the Quakers would have to pay a fine. Within a year, the Quaker Ralph Fretwell was, quote, prosecuted for 80 being present at a meeting in his house, and Richard Sutton was taken to court for 30 enslaved people being present at a meeting. So what is going on here? Why would Quakers be blamed for slave rebellion when they had a peace testimony? What I've learned in doing historical research is that when something doesn't seem to make sense, that's when you need to dig in. And it's actually these incongruencies that can reveal something fundamentally important about a particular place and time. So, 17th century Quakers, I came to understand, were radical, but not because they were abolitionists. Instead, Quakers like George Fox were radical because they suggested that Blacks and whites should meet together for worship. Quakers were not the only Christians who were persecuted for meeting together with enslaved people, and specifically worshiping together. As I began to investigate this further and read through the Anglican and Moravian archives, I realized there were really important similarities in their experiences. In each case, Protestant slave owners attacked missionaries and enslaved Christians for meeting together. On the islands of St. Thomas, for example, Moravian missionaries and Black Christians were actually beaten and attacked by whites. Slave owners stole Bibles from enslaved Christians and they burned Moravian books. I'm going to show you one document that's pretty incredible. This is a letter probably composed by a free Black Moravian woman named Dama, who was writing to the Queen of Denmark. She was St. Thomas at the time was a Danish colony, to ask the Queen to support Black Christians. She asked the Queen to support the Black women of St. Thomas because enslavers would not allow them to, quote, serve the Lord Jesus. This petition was written both in Dutch Creole and also kind of incredibly Dama's native West African language, Bay, on the left. It was accompanied by another letter written by several other Black Moravians that went into more detail about the problems facing enslaved Christians. The white planters, quote, beat and injure us when we learn about the Savior, they wrote. They burn our books, call our baptism the baptism of dogs, and call the brethren beasts. As I looked closer at these and other sources, I began to understand why English slave owners found the prospect of slave conversion so threatening. First of all, what I realized is that when enslaved people became Christian, it was challenging the justification for slavery, which was actually religious difference. And it's really important to note, and I'll go into this later, that there's actually no concept of race that has been developed as we understand it today at this point in time. Second of all, in some cases, missionaries taught enslaved people to read the Bible and to write. This was extremely unpopular and considered to be very dangerous. And third, and really significantly, when enslaved Christians would meet for worship, white colonists feared they were plotting slave rebellion. And you see this in the records over and over and over again, that this idea of worship was a source of anxiety for white slave owners who were constantly paranoid about rebellion. So this is exactly what happened in Barbados. When Quakers started to include enslaved people in their worship meetings, English slave owners reacted aggressively. So when Quaker William Edmondson visited Barbados in 1675, for example, he was attacked by the governor for, quote, making the Negroes Christians and making them rebel and cut their throats. So I want to pause again here because these documents reveal what I think are some of the most misunderstood aspects of colonial slavery. What this history shows us is that English slave owners thought of Christianity, and especially Protestantism, as a religion that was only for free people. And so they worried that a baptized slave would demand freedom and possibly rebel. As a result, they actually excluded the vast majority of enslaved people from Protestant churches. Now, I felt like this was an extremely important aspect of early colonial slavery that had not been fully recognized. And it was also different from the role that Catholicism played in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where enslaved people were baptized as part of the process of enslavement. I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, but the basic difference is that in order to justify and legalize slavery in the Catholic colonies, you were supposed to baptize people when they were enslaved. This did not happen in the Protestant colonies. So in my book, I gave this a name, and I call it Protestant supremacy. So what do I mean by Protestant supremacy? I came to understand that there was a forerunner to white supremacy. White supremacy uses race to create inequality, but in the 17th century, as I mentioned before, race as we know it didn't exist. And most significantly, the concept of whiteness had not really been fully created. And so enslavers created this ideology of Protestant supremacy, which used religion to justify slavery. I turned to legal archives to understand this better. I read through all of the laws passed on the island of Barbados, also in Virginia and elsewhere in the colonies. And in the earliest slave laws, what I found is that colonists didn't actually call themselves white. Instead, they called themselves Christian. So Protestant slave owners constructed a caste system that was based on Christian status. So heathen slaves, quote unquote, heathen slaves were afforded no rights or privileges, while Catholics, Jews, and non-conforming Protestants were viewed with some suspicion and distrust, but granted more protections. So we can see an example of Protestant supremacy in this document. This is a travel account written by an Englishman named Richard Ligon. Ligon published an account of his visit to Barbados in the 1640s. In one story, Ligon described an encounter with an enslaved man who told him he wanted to become a Christian. So Ligon said, great, and said he would help him achieve his goal. But when he spoke to this man's owner, he was surprised at the reply. The slave owner said that, quote, being once a Christian, he could no more account him a slave. And as a result, he would, quote, lose the hold they had of them as slaves by making them Christians, and by that means should open such a gap as all the planters in the island would curse him. So I know the language is a very 17th century, but basically this story shows how English slave owners during this period believed that their status as Protestants was inseparable from their identity as free Europeans. And it also shows how slave conversion and baptism was viewed as a threat to the system of slavery. Right, this slave owner was afraid that baptism would threaten his claim, his property claim to owning another person, and that other slave owners would curse him. The association between Protestantism and freedom was so strong that most enslavers came to dismiss the idea that enslaved people were even eligible for a Protestant baptism. So, for example, in 1661, when the British Parliament instructed the governor of Barbados to, quote, win such as are purchased as slaves to the Christian faith and make them capable of being baptized thereinto, the Barbados Assembly refused to pass a 1663 bill, quote, recommending the christening of Negro children and the instruction of all adults. By 1680, the Barbadian planters' stance against conversion had become actually even more pronounced. So when the Lords of Trade and Plantation in London wrote to the merchants of Barbados to inquire as to, quote, the unhappy state of slaves in Barbados by their not being admitted to the Christian religion, the so-called gentlemen of Barbados explained that, quote, the conversion of their slaves to Christianity would not only destroy their property, but endanger the island. These documents help to explain why it was so controversial for Protestant missionaries to introduce enslaved people to Christianity, because it threatened to undermine Protestant supremacy. Planters regularly attacked missionaries, both verbally and physically, and blamed these evangelizing newcomers for slave rebellions, regardless of evidence to the contrary. The Anglican missionary Elias Noy in New York is another example of this, of the slave rebellion there, or the attempted rebellion. So the next question in my research was, how did this change? How did Protestant supremacy become white supremacy? So we've already seen how this system was challenged, right? It's challenged by missionaries, including the Quakers, also some, not all Anglicans, some Anglicans. It was also challenged by enslaved and free Blacks who wanted to become Christian, people like Dama who wrote that letter. But in each case, it was challenged in a different way. So I'll start with the missionaries. What I found is that Quaker, Anglican, and Moravian missionaries tended to respond to Protestant supremacy by trying to argue that Christianity and slavery were perfectly compatible. Protestant missionaries drew on biblical descriptions of slavery as well as the ideal of the godly household to encourage slave owners to allow enslaved people to convert. right? They noted that Christian slavery had a long and well-established history in Europe and the Catholic American colonies. Missionaries also tried to defend slave conversion by arguing that enslaved Christians would be more docile and harder working than their, quote, heathen counterparts. So in short, Protestant missionaries responded to the hostile environment by articulating and promoting a vision of Christian slavery, hence the title of my book, that reconciled Protestantism with bondage. So for an example of this, we can turn to the Quaker William Edmondson, who is often thought of as one of the first anti-slavery Quakers. But when he was attacked by the governor of Barbados for worshiping along enslaved people, he responded by saying, quote, "It was a good work to bring them to the knowledge of God and Jesus Christ, and that would keep them from rebelling or cutting any man's throat." So the implications here are clear. Conversion would make slavery safer. It would make enslaved people less rebellious. Enslaved Christians fought Protestant supremacy in a different way. As we saw in Dama's letter, they tended to argue that they had a right to practice Christianity, to read the Bible, and to worship together. Over time, more and more enslaved and free people of color fought their way into churches, into Christian churches, and they did so for numerous and complicated reasons that could be theological, practical, community-related, etc. So one of these individuals was named Charles Cuffey. Cuffey, who was born into slavery, was baptized on September 9th, 1677 in the Anglican Church in Barbados. The minister noted that Cuffey had recently been freed, which made him the first free Black man to be baptized on the island. And in 1689, 12 years after his baptism, Cuffey brought two children to the baptismal font, Thomas and Mary. By joining the Anglican Church, Cuffey was really making a claim for himself, right? He was a free Black Christian, and he had also acquired most of the markings of a freeholder, right? According to Barbadian law of the time, he would be eligible to vote in elections and at least hypothetically to run for office if he could acquire enough property. What I realized in this research, it was in response to free Black Christians like Charles Cuffey that English slave owners began to create white supremacy. So soon after Cuffey brought his children to the baptismal font, Barbadian lawmakers wrote a new law redefining citizenship to include the word white as well as Christian. So this was one of the very first times that the word white was actually used in a legal record. And the law declared that, quote, "every white man professing the Christian religion who hath attained to the full age of 21 years and hath 10 acres of freehold shall be deemed a freeholder." 12 years later, lawmakers refined their definition of whiteness even further. A 1709 law clarified that a white person could have, quote, "no extract from an African," thereby establishing the one-drop rule as the definition of whiteness and then laying a new foundation for slavery. That really made race seem like a natural category, right? Something that was innate. So in these laws, what we see is the codification and creation of whiteness as a legal category that was actually specifically intended to exclude free Black Christians from the full rights of citizenship. We often take things like race as a given, but they actually have a specific history. Oftentimes, race is also assumed to be biological, when actually what we see here is that it's created for political purposes, right? It's a political category. As we saw, it was slave-owning politicians who were actively creating this category of whiteness as part of a strategy to protect slave ownership and to restrict rights of voting rights of free Blacks. With the creation of whiteness, slave conversion became less threatening, right? Whiteness rather than religious difference became the new way to justify and enforce slavery. Over time, pro-slavery Christians would also then build on the arguments of the early missionaries to argue that slavery was ordained by God and necessary for evangelization. So, what are we going to do with this history? And how can it help us understand the Revolutionary period, figures like Patrick Henry? I'm going to make a few concluding remarks by commenting on Patrick Henry's own words about slavery. In 1773, Henry wrote the following in response to an anti-slavery book by the Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet. He wrote, "I take this opportunity to acknowledge the receipt of Anthony Benezet's book against the slave trade. I thank you for it. It is not a little surprising that the professors of Christianity, whose chief excellence consists in softening the human heart and in cherishing and improving its finer feelings, should encourage a practice that so totally repugnant to the first impressions of right and wrong." So Henry also continued to remark about his own complicity with slavery, even as he hoped that, quote, "the time will come when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil." So I think that Patrick Henry was raising some of the same questions about the relationship between Christianity and slavery that I had when I started my project. How, in good conscience, could any Christian accept slavery? How did they justify it? What was the what was the sort of the theological reasoning for this relationship between Christianity and slavery? What Henry did not know, and what I did not know when I began my research, was this longer history of Christianity and slavery in early America. Specifically, what I think this shows us is that Christianity was not just a religion, right? It was actually used as a legal category to justify slavery, right? In the legal documents in the early colonies, a Christian can never be a slave, right? And so all of these records refer to Christians only as sort of, we could call it uh, a category that was specifically for free people and not for enslaved people. Before the creation of race, right, Protestant supremacy was the foundation for the system of slavery in the English colonies. Here's something else that Henry probably didn't know. And that's that while Quakers were some of the most active abolitionists of the Revolutionary era, with Anthony Benezet being, along with John Woolman, one of the most important figures in the abolitionist movement, the Quakers themselves did not always oppose slavery, as we have learned. Instead, it took a tremendous amount of effort for a small group of Quakers to change the institution into one that took an abolitionist stance. So, what does this history help us to understand? First of all, I think it offers insights into the history of race. Most people continue to think of race as something that's biological, but I actually think this belief is really destructive because it naturalizes race and allows us to forget that that things like whiteness was actually created in order to legalize and justify inequality. And I also think we need to acknowledge that there were individuals who made decisions that led to the creation of both Protestant supremacy and white supremacy. Right? These were not randomly created out of the ether. The example of Charles Cuffey and sort of his baptism leading to a new law that redefines who's allowed to vote, there were people who were behind the creation of that law, and they were doing it for a very specific reason. Their political purpose was to conserve power. And so if we don't recognize this history, I think we really risk repeating the injuries of the past. Second, I think it's important to think about the many different meanings that religion had in early America. We see in Protestant supremacy that religion could be used as a source of oppression, right? To justify why you're enslaving one person but not another person. But that's certainly not what religion, and specifically Protestant Christianity, meant to enslaved men and women who fought hard to be baptized, because there were many of them. It's also not what it meant to abolitionists like Anthony Benezet. And so, we need to recognize the multiple ways that religion was used in the early American period and keep these different parts of religious history in balance. For those who identify as Christians, I think this history serves as a challenge to think about what it really means to combat oppression, but also how hard it is to combat evils that are deeply embedded in a society, right? By the time the American colonies are slave societies, right? Uh, it's very difficult to fight against it. And there are many people like Henry who, opposed slavery, but did not fight against it in the way we might hope. Um, and finally, I'll say history is never inevitable. And people can change the course of history, right? Things could have developed differently. As we all know, Christians, both Black and white, actually played a central role in the abolitionist movement, showing how Christianity could be used to support emancipation. We can look at men like Anthony Benezet and see someone who truly helped to change the course of Quaker history and helped to end the transatlantic slave trade. We can and should remember those abolitionist Christians and learn from them, but we can't forget the rest of this history of Christian slavery, or we risk repeating it. Thank you so much.
All right. Dr. Gerbner, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really wonderful and extremely informative. I definitely learned a lot, and I hope our viewers did too. So now's the time. If you have any questions or any comments, please do leave those in the chat. While we're waiting for folks to type in some questions, I'll start us off on one. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about some of the reasons why enslaved persons in early America wanted to convert to Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, another reason that I wanted to write about this period is because typically, historians say that the Great Awakening in the 1740s is really like the beginning of Black Protestantism, that it's not until you get the evangelical revival movements that you have more enslaved and free Black people joining Protestant churches. But what I saw was that there was this whole period where they were basically forbidden from joining churches. And so the explanation can't be they didn't want to. There were many people who did not want to, but there were also so many examples of enslaved and free Black people who were basically, excluded from from Protestant churches. And so this was, in addition to sort of talking more about the complicated relationship between Christianity and slavery during this period, I also wanted to know what were the motivations. So I think there were many, and obviously it depends on the person, but there were a few broad themes that I saw. We can take this letter that was written by this African woman named Dama as sort of an insight into at least why one sort of, as she was free at this point, one formerly enslaved person wanted to join a Protestant community. And it was certainly partly it was theological. I think the Moravian missionaries specifically spoke a lot about the blood and wounds of Christ, suffering, the importance of suffering and how that showed sort of a certain sense of holiness. So I think that's a theological element that was really important. There's also community building. I've looked at the sort of the development of Afro-Protestant congregations, and you can actually see sort of families joining together. It becomes a really important institution for protecting Black communities, even early on. And another thing that I found to be so important was literacy and education. So, like I mentioned, missionaries, not all missionaries, and missionaries changed over time. If those of you who have heard of the slave Bible, where they cut out any passages from the Bible that might, induce a rebellion, like all of Exodus. But the idea of teaching enslaved people to read and write, it was something that a lot of enslaved people wanted those skills, but slave owners were really afraid of. But that's why, I think it's so fascinating in the case of the Moravians that they start calling white colonists book burners. That's literally, they say they're burning our books, they're taking our things. And so there were a number of different reasons that uh, you have enslaved and free Blacks sort of actually fighting through a lot of persecution in order to join these churches.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good answer. So we have a question from Barry Griffith on YouTube. And you talked about this a little more just now, but he says, please comment on the Moravian position on slavery. Residents of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, home of a large Moravian community.
Yes, that is one of the, I grew up in Philadelphia, so not close from Bethlehem, which is the other major Moravian community in North America. The Moravians changed over time. And actually, one of the things that I do in my book is I look at the very earliest Moravian missionaries, and they said that they wanted to become slaves in order to spread the gospel to enslaved people. These were two Europeans from Central Europe who were, working class, and so they try to become slaves. They are not allowed to, because by that point we have race-based slavery is established, and they're told no, that's not a possibility. They go to the Caribbean, and they what you see happening over time is that as they realize all of the barriers to being able to evangelize to enslaved people, all of the barriers that slave owners are putting up, they slowly start changing their stance on slavery. And eventually, by the time they leave, they are embracing sort of this idea of spiritual, like a difference between spiritual freedom and earthly freedom. And they begin to not just, they do what the other sort of Protestant missionaries in my book do, which is they begin to start justifying slavery through a Christian lens, which they hadn't done before. And this is, again, I think from a modern perspective, a very disappointing sort of shift. But that's sort of the typical thing that I saw. So, yeah, I actually, my second book, which is just came out, Archival Irruptions, it's using the Moravian records in Jamaica from the 1750s. By that point, the Moravians are the Moravian Church owns slaves, and they're also evangelizing to enslaved people. So it's a very complicated relationship, and yeah, I could go on about it, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. We have another question from YouTube from Ethan. Could you please elaborate more on whiteness and how it was created?
Yeah, I think what I mean by this is, when we look at how people identify themselves, right? Like, what are the ways in which a group of people distinguishes themselves from other people, and what are the important categories that they use? You know, all of the ways that we describe ourselves today have a history. Whether it's, if you decide to describe yourself as a Christian, as a white person, I'm trying to think of as an American, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, actually, that's probably a good comparison. 400 years ago, it meant something very different to describe yourself as an American. That is an identity category that has a history, and we can trace its development, right, through the American. Well, we could look even farther, right? The sort of the reason that the Americas were called America, the Americas, then the way that the term American was used in the early colonial period, which was referred to Native Americans, to the adoption of the term America by in the Revolutionary period to refer to then the United States of America. So race has the same history. There are something like whiteness. When we think about white people, that didn't exist 400 years ago. I mean, there are people who had, pale skin, but they wouldn't necessarily call themselves white.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same way that we can trace the development of a category of an American, or, whatever other one you want to sort of suggest, that's what I mean, that it is created. And so it's not some essential part of anybody's, DNA. It's some people would call it a social construct. Like I argue that it's a political construct, but we've sort of largely forgotten that history. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my research is to show that that actually has a history. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that was great. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Dr. Gerbner, thank you so much for your talk. That really was fantastic. I will definitely be looking into both of your books. They sound really fascinating. And everyone listening, tune in next time for our next month's Red Hill Rediscovered. And thank you all so much for listening this time.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.